Welcome back to Combat Mission Battle for Normandy for a game from the Few Good Men's 2019 Garry Owen Cup. This is a combat mission competition in the style of the Ryder Cup. Team USA faces off against Team Rest of the World in a series of mirrored quick battles, 5 from Battle for Normandy and 5 from Final Blitzkrieg. Each player takes part in 2 battles. This is my Normandy battle where the Canadians under NEZ 73 are conducting a small-scale probe into the town of Malto near Hill 112, and my job is to stop them with the Luftwaffe. Despite nominally being an air force, the Luftwaffe did deploy ground forces throughout World War II, and one very famous force in particular. This battle translates into an opportunity for me to take the Fallschirmjaeger, German paratroopers, out into the field. The field itself is a modified version of the Malto map from the Commonwealth module's Shadow of the Hill series of scenarios. The village of Malto dominates, forming a T-shape with the Canadians attacking from the bottom. This is the dense core of the map, plenty of buildings, short lines of sight, lots of barrage walls and fence lines. Around this central core is less dense terrain, small fields and orchards, and finally outside of the village on the flanks and in the rear are large open fields that gently slope up towards the left and right edges of the map. This is a probe, so the victory points are pretty evenly balanced between securing the ground objectives and causing casualties. There are 500 points for shooting things and 5 ground objectives, each one worth 83 points. That means that the ground objectives add up to a total of 415, don't ask me why, so there are 915 points available in total. Regarding the objectives, Objective 1 is up front and within easy reach of the attacker halfway up the vertical road, but Objectives 2, 3 and 4 are spread out along the horizontal road about 2/3 of the way up the map, with Objective 5 all the way back at Malto Church. There's 45 minutes on the clock. The weather is rain and mist, the ground is damp. For force selection, the attacking Canadians have 2,162 points to spend, and I have 1,475. This is enough for me to bring along a single regular quality Fallschirmjaeger company with enough points left over for a few extras. This translates into 3 platoons of infantry, which are going to form the backbone of my defence. Each platoon has an 81mm mortar and a Panzerschreck team to back up its 3 infantry squads. Each infantry squad is made up of 3 fire teams, 1 4-man team with the squad leader and 2 rifle grenade launchers, then 2 3-man teams built around light machine guns. Between them, they have a significant amount of firepower. They're split about 50-50 between rifles and automatic weapons of various types. MP40s, MP44s, MG34 or 42s, and unique to the German Paras, the FG42. This volume of firepower down at squad level is reinforced by the terrain. The attacker has 3 broad avenues of approach here, on either flank or up the middle. The flanks are very open with some long sight lines. This is not only very uncomfortable terrain if you're an allied player trying to advance infantry and Shermans against well-concealed, hard-hitting German anti-tank guns, but an advance on the left or right would be exposed to flanking fire from defending forces set up in the centre. As such, the dense terrain running down the centre of the map on either side of the vertical road is where I'm focusing my defence. I mentioned before that the village forms a T-shape, and this is the shape that I'm broadly conforming to with my setup. I have 1 platoon up front, ahead of Objective 1, with the other 2 on either side of the T-junction. My forward platoon is set up on both sides of the road, with 1 squad and the mortar covering the orchard on the left, 1 squad spread throughout the buildings, and the last squad covering a stretch of open ground on the right. The squads have all been split down into their teams so that I can disperse them. This reduces their vulnerability to incoming fire and allows them to defend a wider area. The platoon's Panzerschreck team is in a building where it can see down the main road, covering a corner to reduce the impact of any direct fire, and it has an all-important side door to a covered escape route should it need to bug out. I'm not really intending to cover the main road against armour, at least not directly. The only real means of doing this would be to set something up way back at the T-junction, which seems so obvious as to be not worth it. As a little insurance should the enemy bring tanks down the main road though, I've dug in some anti-tank mines at a choke point. With any luck, anything they immobilise or destroy might make a good roadblock and at least give me time to redeploy some other anti-tank assets from other areas of the map. Finally, rounding out the forward platoon, I have a trio of 3-man scout teams. These are all armed with MP40 submachine guns, except one man with an FG42, and these are there to act as outposts. 2 of the teams are moving up on turn 1 to occupy buildings on either side of the road, beyond the limits of my deployment zone, and the third team is camped out in a barn off to the right, where they can hopefully give me some early warning of any enemy activity over in the orchard on that side. Overall, the plan with my forward platoon is to lie in wait and ambush the enemy as he moves forward. On the left he has to advance through this orchard, and on the right he has to cross this open ground, which is less absolute distance, but has the added issue of flanking fire from one of the scout teams. The idea is to cause maximum casualties and then pull back before the Canadians can bring their firepower to bear. It's unlikely to pan out like that. Disengaging in the face of the enemy is one of the most difficult battlefield actions out there, but even if it goes wrong, I should hopefully be piling up bodies and burning time. Of my 2 rear platoons, the one on the left is my reserve. It's hunkering down in some of the village's chunkier buildings to try and mitigate the effects of any enemy artillery, and it's going to be moving into position as the situation dictates. My right-hand platoon is in a similar position, though one of its squads is spread out along the edge of the wood adjoining this large open field in case the enemy pushes the centre right. Backing up the infantry, I have 2 platoons from the Battalion Weapons Company. The first of these is a machine gun platoon, split into 2 sections. That's 4 tripod-mounted MG42s altogether, which are capable of more effective sustained fire than the MG42s in the bipod-mounted LMG role down in the infantry squads. The other platoon is armed with recoilless guns, 2 75mm LG40s. These are fancy paratrooper weapons that are similar in role to infantry guns, with the practical advantage of breaking down into easily man-packable and parachutable parts. They come with 29 rounds of ammunition, 19 high explosive rounds, 4 high explosive anti-tank rounds, and 6 armour piercing, and I'm essentially intending to use them as cheap and slightly less effective anti-tank guns. Both of these platoons are set up to bulk out the flanks. On the left, the recoilless gun is covering the open fields, and there is an MG covering both the inside and outside edges of the village. On the right, the remaining weapons are focused on that centre right field, with the recoilless and one of the MGs set up next to the road, and the final MG a little bit further back, covering the field through a gap in the bocage. Finally, for the force selection, my main anti-tank capability lies with a pair of Marder 3Ms. The Marder is a tank destroyer, essentially a 75mm Pak 40 on tracks. It has no other armament, the armour won't stop anything nastier than small arms fire, and to cap it all, the fighting compartment is open top, so any enemy infantry who get behind it can simply shoot the crew in the back. On the plus side though, the Pak 40 isn't going to have any problems penetrating the Shermans that I'm expecting to meet. The Marders are infinitely more mobile than towed anti-tank guns for only a few points more, and my only other armour option is the Stug, which, despite having its own advantages, costs twice as much. I would far rather have the redundancy and increased capability of 2 Marders than a single Stug. Both of them are starting off covering the flanks, but I'm going to be redeploying them to try and destroy any enemy armour as the situation develops. They're not likely to win any duels against Allied armour, but handled as ambush predators, they should be able to take advantage of any opportunities that present themselves. The Marders, and to a lesser extent the LG40s, are going to be critical here because they give me the opportunity to break a leg off of the enemy's combined arms tripod. Infantry and armour working together make a very effective team. The infantry spot targets and protect the tanks smash anything that holds the infantry up. Operating separately, they're much more vulnerable, and because there will be fewer tanks to target than infantry, it makes sense to concentrate on the armour to break that team up faster. So I have a few things going on with this defence. First of all, it's set up to cover the enemy's most likely avenue of approach, the main road, but with enough flexibility to switch to focus on either flank if need be. Secondly, it's a defence with plenty of depth. Not only am I going to be able to wear him down and run down the clock by giving up space in exchange for time and ambush opportunities, but the bulk of my force is way back at the intersection line, where it's protected from enemy observation and direct fire. Finally, as I just mentioned, this is a combined arms defence. I'm confident in my ability to deal with both enemy infantry and enemy armour. It would be better if I had some artillery on call. Artillery makes almost everything better, but I can't afford it, and in any case the terrain in the centre, where I'd most likely want to use it, is dense enough to make calling fire missions a massive pain without spending even more points on target reference points. The silver lining to that is that it works both ways, and the Canadians will also find it difficult to call for fire in the village. That's about all I can do before the game starts. The first few turns are pretty quiet, the only movement is my two scout teams astride the road moving forward as planned, but soon fragmentary spots on enemy infantry start to pop up in the orchard and on the main road. These all look like two-man scout teams broken off from regular Canadian infantry squads. They've got those easily identifiable Commonwealth-style helmets and uniforms along with Lee Enfield rifles, so I'm immediately able to start processing information about what kind of force I might be up against. Shortly after the first spots, my pixel trip and pick up on more enemy infantry on the edge of the orchard and armour sound contacts on the main road and off to the centre right. And it already looks like it's going to get to crunch time on the left. All of my pixel tripping are hiding with short target arcs. Ideally I'd want to have lots of juicy targets in front of them before they engage, but those Canadian scout teams are closing in, and that means that I have a choice between opening fire and risking and being seen and engaged while my troops still have their target arcs on, meaning that they won't return fire. It's always better to be the active participant in these things, so the order goes out to open up. Three of the scouts go down almost immediately. They've done their job of protecting the main force from nasty surprises, and a few Canadian teams moving into the orchard are quickly stopped in their tracks until they have a rethink and start to fall back. There's not a lot of fire coming in, and with the mortar getting its iron and starting to land bombs on the opposite hedge line, it seems like things have kicked off quite nicely. Then something unpleasant rolls up. It's a Crusader AA vehicle, an obsolete British tank from earlier in the war that's had a pair of 20mm Oerlikon cannons crammed into the turret. The Allies don't exactly have a lot of anti-air work to do at this stage in the war, but it turns out that two rapid-firing 20mm guns also make extremely effective anti-infantry weapons. The Crusader starts to engage the command team of my squad covering the orchard, which takes a casualty and understandably goes to the ground for a while. This breaks the Crusader's spot on them, and while it switches targets to give my scouts by the road a burst, things quieten down slightly on the left. This isn't set to last. The enemy infantry are still there, and they get more support as a Sherman rolls up. So it's time to go. I've got a squad and a mortar team opposing what looks like a platoon with armour support over here, and that's not a context that I'm going to win. I've got my hits in, forced the enemy to stop and deploy. Now it's time to disengage and pull back. Not to waste an opportunity though, the 81mm stays behind for another turn to cover the retreat by targeting the Sherman. The range is short and the 81mm is pretty accurate at this distance. A few bombs land directly on the enemy tank, including one on the main gun, which, if they aren't destroying subsystems like periscopes and radios, should at least be damaging them. Events are a little slower to pan out on the right. The scouts in the centre have already gunned down a pair of scouts on the main road, and then gotten into a firefight with enemy infantry on the other side. And with more Canadian scout teams pressing in a little close for comfort both near the village and at the barn, I give the orders to open fire on this flank just as my squad on the left starts to disengage. The ranges on the right are shorter, and the effects of all the Fallschirmjaeger's automatic weapons correspondingly more devastating, especially when combined with the 3 extra MP40s of the cottage scout team coming in from an awkward angle. The Canadian infantry are caught in a bad place and lose a whole squad and more in the first minute, despite one of the LMG teams having to break off to throw hand grenades at some entirely different enemy pixel truppen coming in from their right. These enemy pixel truppen are Canadian airborne, which can only be from a different formation to the regular infantry I've been dealing with so far. The team in question had the misfortune to end its turn within a stone's throw of the barn, and they were shot up by the Fallschirmjägers hiding inside as they moved up to appear on the right flank of my ambush. The presence of another Canadian formation makes my estimation of enemy strength a lot more difficult. I'm now trying to slot what enemy units I see into the framework of at least 2 separate companies instead of just one. I don't know how much of either is actually present. Back on the right, it's time to go almost as quickly as things started. There are 2 Fireflies and plenty of reinforcements following up the first wave of Canadians, and I'm not keen on hanging around to get shot at by tanks. This is already proving a good move on the left, where the hedgerows I've just vacated are being smothered with 20mm fire. And, as if I needed the encouragement, my scouts on the main road are blasted by a shot from the 17-pounder. This feels as though it's the cue for the tables to start turning. I've gotten the first hits in, but now I'm trying to disengage as NSZ 73 brings his superior combat power to bear. The Panzerschreck team misses a flanking shot on one of the Fireflies and is snuffed out by Sten gun fire from the masses of Canadian paras coming forward. The scout team in the cottage is wiped out when more paras blast through the back wall and storm their building. The scouts in the barn are gunned down by tank machine gun fire. While the second Firefly has taken up a position on the main road, where it begins shelling any houses that show signs of resistance. Swarms of enemy infantry are surging through the village, overwhelming my little teams of Fallschirmjaeger. The action is expanding to the flanks as well. Screened off from the centre by a smoke screen, an enemy infantry push has been advancing along the edge of the village under the eyes of the Crusader AA. The left-hand Marder couldn't draw line of sight, but the recoilless rifle over on that flank could, and managed to score a few penetrations as well as landing some shells in amongst the infantry. The hits on the Crusader weren't enough to knock it out, but it did fall back, leaving the infantry on its own as it hooked in towards the first objective. This is exactly what I mean by separating the enemy infantry from its armour. Without support from the Crusader, the enemy infantry run into my redeployed left-hand squad, and despite taking down 2 of the Fallschirmjaeger in the ensuing firefight, quickly lose their momentum and fall back. On the right, however, the Canadians haven't been separated from their armour support and they have more success. My squad in the edge of the wood has to fall back a little in the fire, and the Firefly has stopped in a position where the Marder can't see it. The LG-40 is just about able to draw line of sight, but the angle is bad and it fails to land any hits. The Firefly doesn't seem to have this problem, and a lucky hit knocks the recoilless gun out, leaving the Panzerschreck team in the woods the only real anti-tank asset I have covering that field. In the centre around Objective 1 meanwhile, the game is up. Enemy infantry are everywhere, a Firefly is dominating the buildings from the main road, and despite giving a good account of themselves, my pixel trippin are inevitably mopped up. My forward platoon got its hits in and went down fighting, but not only does this mean I'm not going to be contesting every inch of the village astride the main road as I intended, but I have no way of knowing if I've inflicted meaningful casualties on the enemy. If I had seen just Canadian regulars or just Canadian airborne, then I could start coming up with some reasonable guesstimates of what force I'm up against, how many casualties is taken, and how much more combat power I can expect to face. But having clearly seen infantry squads from both type of formation, I'm really not sure what I'm up against. I do know that I haven't managed to break that infantry armour team though. I've only hit 2 of the 4 enemy tanks so far. Although I haven't seen the Sherman since I've fallen back from the auction, I only hit it with 81mm mortar bombs, which basically have no chance of taking it out. So I have to assume that that's still up and running. I've definitely hit the Crusader AA out on the left, but despite causing a casualty in the turret, it was alive enough to reverse away, and it soon pops back up on the main road. I haven't touched the 2 Fireflies, and because I'm struggling to narrow down NZ-73's force selection, I don't know if he's holding more tanks at the back in reserve. So overall, as I start deploying my 2 rear platoons to focus on covering the main road, things could be better. Sure, at this line I'm going to have twice as many men as I had up front, but if the Canadians hit me here like they hit me there, then I'm going to be in a world of trouble. I can fall back from and sacrifice Objective 1. I can't afford to lose Objectives 2, 3 and 4. There is, however, some silver lining as the Canadians mop up. The Firefly on the main road reverses into the anti-tank mines which immobilise it. It's still capable of fighting, but in this kind of dense terrain its field of fire is pretty much limited to the main road and it can't follow up its supporting infantry. That's 1 down. The second Firefly pulls back from the right hand field, skirts around the edge of the village and then pops back up in the right hand orchard. Originally I thought that it was coming to get a different angle on the LG-40. I can't tell if the enemy knows if it's been knocked out or not, but when it seemingly lines up on my right hand Marder, it looks like I might have a problem. I'd given that Marder orders to shift position slightly so it had a better angle on the Firefly's previous position, and it's experiencing some kind of pathfinding fit, trying to navigate the edges of some impassable forest tiles. When the Firefly lines up on it, my little tank destroyer is rotating on the spot in pretty much the most agonising way possible. But it's a small target in good concealment. Despite pointing in the right direction, the Firefly never makes the spot, and the Marder gets the first shot off. Almost all tank engagements are won by the party that shoots first. This one is no exception. The Marder's 75mm Pak-40 puts a round through the Firefly's gun barrel and into the gun mantlet. It's only a partial penetration on the turret, but with its main gun out of action, the Firefly has no means of retaliating even if the crew got over their significant emotional event and tried to engage. The first follow-up shot goes through the lower front hill by the driver's feet, and the second hits the other side of the gun mantlet, knocking the tank out. In the same turn, The crew of the immobilised Firefly bail out, leaving me the Crusader AA and the 75mm Sherman as the only enemy armour contacts I know that I have to deal with. And it looks like the actions of the LG-40 on the left, and the Marder along with my infantry on the right, have convinced the Canadians to go for the centre. After all, there's nothing obvious ahead of them right now. There are even a few squads of Canadian airborne using the main road without coming under fire. That's not a state of affairs that lasts for very long. I've been deploying my remaining 2 platoons in the buildings and along the hedgerows at the base of the road, and the space between the Canadians and the Fallschirmjaeger quickly turns into a 2-way range. On the left, I'm able to put some effective oblique fire down through the orchard with some infantry and an 81mm mortar, inflicting heavy casualties on the swarm of airborne pushing down the road and leaving them pinned in place. Enemy armour support is moving up. The Crusader has had to take a detour through the village by Objective 1 to get past the immobilised Firefly, which has been recrewed and has spent a little time putting shells into some of the buildings down at the T-junction. I'm a little concerned about covering my left just in case the enemy makes a push there, but with my right relatively secure thanks to my position in the woods and the right field, I'm free to manoeuvre forwards with that Marder. I've got to move it anyway because it's a good policy to relocate after it's potentially given its position away, and as it hunts forward it happens upon a keyhole through the village where it can spot the disabled Firefly. 2 quick shots, one into the hull and the other into the turret, and the Firefly moves up out of action. The Marder doesn't have eyes on the Crusader AA though, which rushes down the road to support the struggling Canadian infantry. This gives them enough impetus to almost wipe out the team I had in the closest building. When the Crusader has come within line of sight of one of my Panzerschreck teams, the first rocket only just misses the front of the vehicle, detonating on the road underneath, but it's enough to provoke the crew into reversing away. It manages to pull back, with another Panzerschreck rocket skimming overhead, but the infantry it's trying to support are getting hammered from both flanks. They're caught in a searing crucible, having to advance into the V between my 2 infantry platoons, a 100-metre square kill zone saturated with fire from 9 MG42s and a pair of 81mm mortars. There are casualties on both sides of course, but with my team spread out in the buildings and the gardens, firing through keyholes and awkward angles, the Canadians lose their momentum. A last gasp attack on the closest house disintegrates under fire. And the final nail in the coffin is hammered in by the 81mm mortar on my right. This is area targeting a gap in the Picard alongside the main road, and the first bomb on target lands in a bunched up squad of Canadian airborne, wiping them out. To add insult to injury, a fragment hits one of the exposed crewmen in the turret of the Crusader AA just as it peeks out to re-engage, prompting the driver to bail and the vehicle to become knocked out. There are still 21 minutes on the clock, but on the next turn NSZ 73 hits the surrender button. Looking at the casualty figures, it's easy to see why. Out of 195 Canadians who came to the fight, only 44 are still going. They've suffered 102 dead and 49 wounded, along with the loss of 3 tanks. By comparison, I've lost 57 men overall, 28 dead, 25 wounded and 4 taken prisoner, but I have 135 still capable of putting up resistance. In short, the defence worked pretty much as well as I could have hoped, but the critical point was the period between my forward platoon getting overrun and the attack on the intersection kicking off. This was when the enemy infantry armour team broke down. Once the first Firefly had been immobilised on the mines and the second had been taken out by the Marder, the enemy infantry were left trying to break into that kill zone on their own. Not only was the Crusader AA delayed by having to negotiate around the obstacle of the first Firefly, but the impact of a single vehicle was always going to be limited by the dense terrain around the T-junction. The 75mm Sherman from the beginning was conspicuously absent because it hasn't moved from where I'd seen it last. The mortar fire aimed at it had broken its tracks and immobilised it. The other really interesting aspect of this game was the numerical difference between the two sides. Adding up the numbers at the end of the fight shows that I brought along 192 pixel truppen and the Canadians attacked with 195. So in terms of absolute manpower, it was an even fight. The difference is that all of the enemy vehicles and airborne were crack or elite experience. In other words, this game has a quality versus quantity backdrop to it. Sure, man for man, the Canadian airborne were better troops than my Fallschirmjaeger, but with my pixel truppen having the advantage of being on the defence, it's difficult to tell whether the qualitative difference directly impacted the result. I was certainly less worried about the enemy infantry advance down the main road than I was about the possibility of another enemy infantry force popping up on my flank and forcing me to dilute my defence, or about enemy artillery or mortars plastering my line at the intersection. But the quality-quantity debate is one for another time in a separate video. This was a solid game and a lot closer than it looked. If a few things had gone differently and I hadn't managed to break down the Canadians' armour infantry team, then events could have slid the other way very quickly. Big shout out to AnySaid73 here, who has the consolation that his team won the Garry Owen Cup again, but there's always next year. Hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you in the next video.